All right, everyone. So let's talk about the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is a major point of tension between NATO and Russia. And now that you have Finland being a member of NATO, what that means is that NATO now has more control over the Baltic Sea. They want to squeeze the Russians out of the Baltic Sea. And I was reading an article today. It was published by The Economist, and it had this quote from this analyst for the Atlantic Union think tank. Her name is Anna Weislander. And Anna Weislander stated, Russia is still there, meaning the Baltic Sea, but it will be more squeezed. So you have these Europeans, these Germans and these Nordic peoples and these Baltic peoples, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, who despise Russia. They hate Russia, and they have histories of violence with Russia, and they want to push the Russians out of the Baltic Sea. That will never happen without a war. It would be impossible to push the Russians out of the Baltic Sea without a war, and the Europeans are preparing for a war with the Russians. Last year, the 4 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, agreed, or they expressed their intention to unite all of their air forces. We're talking about a major military integration, the integration of the Danish, Norwegian, Finnish, Swedish air forces. And this is what the Europeans have been working on. And I've said this many times, and I'll keep saying this. The Germans have taken the Dutch military and integrated it into the German armed forces. The Dutch military is now a part of the German military. And why this fact never became major news is a huge enigma for me. It is an absolute shocker for me as to why this never became major news. We are looking at the revival of the Reich. That's what we're seeing. That's what we are seeing. And this is why I say that a war between the Russians and the Europeans is inevitable. Because the Europeans, the German-led Europeans, because that's what the EU is, want to control the Baltic Sea. They want to push the Russians out. That will never happen without a fight. Because the Russians have coastlines on the Baltic Sea. The Russians have Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad does not share a contiguous border with the Russian Federation. It is sandwiched in between Poland and Lithuania. And the Lithuanians have been wanting to suffocate Kaliningrad from any sort of supplies from the Russian Federation. This is what the Lithuanians want. In fact, in 2022, there was a serious event that took place, which was a major point of tension between the Russians and the Lithuanians, in which the Lithuanians blocked goods from being sent to Kaliningrad. And what did Putin tell the Lithuanians? He said, if you keep this up, there's going to be a punishment. So the tension is building up. The tension is building up. And if you look at the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, these 3 countries have histories, very strong histories of Nazism. And it's quite scary. Lithuania, for example. Lithuania had the LAF, the Lithuanian Activist Front. This was a Nazi paramilitary organization of Lithuanian patriots who wanted to fight for their country against Bolshevism. And they ended up just mass raping and butchering the Polish people. So you have these Polish people who are extremely anti-Russia. But let's not forget Poland. Who butchered your people? I understand that the Soviets butchered Poles, but the Lithuanians butchered Polish people. Let's not forget that history. Let's not pretend that is in the past, or that's just in the past, and that such an evil ideology is no longer existent. Estonia, Latvia, both of these countries had numerous members of their populations joining the SS. And today, in Latvia and Estonia, you have cults of admiration and remembrance for those members of their countries who joined the SS. So that Nazism, that spirit of Nazism, is still there. And there is a lot of ultranationalism in these Baltic countries, which means that the prospect for the revival of Nazism in these countries is extremely real, just like it is in Ukraine. Just like you have all these neo-Nazis in Ukraine, just like how in Ukraine you have this admiration, this cult of admiration for Nazi collaborators like Bandera, Shukovich, Melnik. You have the same sort of spirit in these Baltic countries. And with the tension building up, with the prospect of war becoming ever so higher every year, that nationalism is increasing. And I wrote an article about the Baltic states a number of years ago, and I said, the Baltic regions are a powder keg. They are a ticking time bomb. And they are ethnic Russian minorities who live in all three of these countries. And there are also there's also an ethnic Polish minority that lives in Lithuania. And both of these ethnic minorities say that they are discriminated against, say that they suffer from racism or that they suffer from prejudice. And so maybe one day in the future, these ethnic Russians will be killed in pogroms, or the discrimination against them will be increased. And what could happen in the future is the Russians will say, okay, these people are messing with our people, and we have to do something to defend them. That could happen. That could happen. But the reality is, however this war is going to break out, it's going to break out. Because NATO is continuously pushing Russia in the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic Sea is of vital importance for the Russians. And they cannot lose any sort of control over the Baltic Sea. So obviously what's going to happen is a war. And look at what's been going on with the European Union. You have the European Union working to change its protocol in regards to war. The EU recently announced that it trained around 40,000 Ukrainians. The European Union has said that they want to give out about 5 billion euros a year to Ukraine. The European Union now wants to focus more on creating European military technology as opposed to just depending on America for military technology and weaponry. And when you see the European Union focusing on training the Ukrainians, call me crazy, but it reminds me of the Nazis training the Ukrainians. If you look at the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and if you look at the Ukrainian Nazis who sided, the Ukrainian Nazis who were working with the Germans against the Poles and against the Russians, these Ukrainians were armed, and a lot of them were trained by the Germans. The Germans had training grounds. I mean, if you look at history, you can see parallels with today. They had training grounds in Germany, in Austria, to train Ukrainians to fight against the Soviets. That's what they were doing in the Second World War. They were training Ukrainians. And these Ukrainians were ultra-nationalists. They hated Polish people. They hated Russians. They wanted to butcher Russians. And they did. They committed horrendous war crimes against Poles, Jews, Russians. And look at what Germany is doing now. Look at what the European Union is doing now. They're training Ukrainians. And who are these Ukrainians? Ultra-nationalists, neo-Nazis who admire the who really admire their Nazi predecessors. They admire Bandera, Shukovich, Melnik. They admire mass murderers. And here are the Germans. Here is the EU boasting about how they have trained 40,000 Ukrainians. What's happening? What's happening is the revival of the Reich. When you see the Nordic countries talking about integrating their air forces, when you see the Dutch military being integrated into the German military, and this is not just some sort of hypothetical. This already happened. The integration of the Dutch armed forces into the German military already happened. Already happened. When you see this sort of thing, when you see the Germans pushing more and more for this idea of an EU military, when you see the Germans saying that Germany must be the most powerful military in Europe, must be the defender of Europe, and we Europeans cannot be so dependent on the Americans anymore. When you see this sort of thing happening, when you're seeing the EU saying, we really need to change our way of doing things. We can no longer just be this bloc that promotes peace and democracy. We have to be a serious military machine with military might. What you're seeing is the revival of the Reich. Because at the end of the day, who runs the EU? I understand America, the American empire, has much control over the European Union. But if you look at the EU itself, what is the most powerful country in the EU? It's Germany. And the Germans want to lead a European bloc. And to go back to the Baltic Sea tensions between Russia and NATO, was not Kaliningrad a part of Germany at one point in time? Was not Kaliningrad a part of the Kingdom of Prussia? Was not Kaliningrad under the Nazis? And how did the Germans lose Kaliningrad? They lost it to the Soviets. They lost it to the Russians. Who are the Europeans at conflict with? They are at conflict with the Russians. The Germans want to take back what was taken from them. And when you see, for example, people in the Baltic states talking about how the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake. For example, Kristianis Karins, Latvia's foreign minister, stated recently that the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake. And when you see, for example, Linas Linkevičius, I swear these Baltic names sound like they want to go back to the Roman Empire, Linas Linkevičius, Lithuania's former foreign minister, stating, quote, with the opening of the Baltic Sea as a NATO sea, the Suwalki Gap becomes less vulnerable. Maybe the Russians should become more worried. Kaliningrad will not survive if they dare to challenge NATO. When you see this sort of rhetoric, talking about how Kaliningrad will not survive, talking about how the Baltic Sea is now a NATO sea or a NATO lake, these are all statements of aggression and provocation. The Russians cannot afford to be pushed away from the Baltic Sea. It will go to war. So what does this mean? What it means is that you're going to be seeing the revival of European nationalism and militarism. There's a very common trope in American rhetoric that says something like, the Europeans have become pussified, they're just going to sit around, nothing's going to happen. But when you see serious talk about military integration and the actual carrying out of military integration between the Dutch and the Germans, when you're seeing the Nordic countries talking about integrating all of their air forces, when you're seeing the Europeans talking about becoming more and more independent in regards to creating military technology and weaponry, when you see Poland, Germany, and the Netherlands talking about creating a Schengen military zone between the three countries so that these three countries can have their militaries move within their countries without any sort of issues. When you're seeing the Europeans saying that the Europeans must take a hold of their own European destiny and not be so dependent on the Americans, when you see this sort of rhetoric, what you're seeing are presaging signs for the coming of a pan-European military machine. I think that in the future, you're not going to recognize Europe from what it is now. You're going to be seeing more of an aggressive bloc. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.